September the 7th, 1940, marked the beginning of the most sustained aerial bombing campaign in history. As dusk settled over London, 348 German bombers, escorted by 617 fighters, crossed the English Channel. The Luftwaffe's strategy was simple but brutal: bomb British cities into submission, break civilian morale, and force Churchill to negotiate peace. The first wave arrived at 4 p.m, but it was the night raids that truly terrorized Londoners. From 8 p.m. until 4:30 a.m, wave after wave of bombers dropped their deadly cargo. The sound of air raid sirens became the soundtrack of British life for the next 8 months. On the night of December the 29th, 1940, the Luftwaffe launched one of its most devastating attacks. Over 24,000 high-explosive bombs and 100,000 incendiaries rained down on London in what became known as the Second Great Fire of London. St. Paul's Cathedral stood defiantly amid the flames, becoming an enduring symbol of British resistance. Firefighters worked through the night as temperatures reached inferno levels, with firestorms creating their own weather systems. November 14, 1940, saw one of the war's most concentrated night attacks. Coventry, an industrial city in the English Midlands, became the target of Operation Mondscheinsonnet, Moonlight Sonata. At 7 p.m, the air raid sirens wailed. By 7:20 p.m, the first Pathfinder aircraft marked the city with incendiary bombs, creating a perfect target for the 449 bombers that followed. For 11 hours straight, the Luftwaffe pounded Coventry. The medieval cathedral, standing since the 14th century, was gutted by fire. Over 4,300 homes were destroyed, and 568 civilians died. The Germans even coined a new word, konfrontieren, meaning to utterly destroy a city. Survivors described the night as apocalyptic. The city centre became an inferno so intense that it could be seen from over 100 miles away. Families huddled in shelters, listening to the earth-shaking explosions above, never knowing if their homes would still be standing when they emerged. The psychological scars ran deep. Children who experienced that night reported nightmares for decades afterward. On the Eastern Front, an extraordinary group of women turned night flying into a weapon of terror for the Germans. The 588th Night Bomber Regiment, nicknamed Night Witches by terrified Wehrmacht soldiers, conducted harassment bombing raids that were as effective as they were unnerving. Flying obsolete Polikarpov Po-2 biplanes, these women pioneered a unique tactic. They would idle their engines near German positions and glide silently toward their targets. The only sound was the wind whistling through the aircraft's canvas and wood frame, a soft whooshing that German soldiers compared to a witch's broomstick. These slow, vulnerable aircraft made up to 18 missions per night. The Po-2 was so primitive that it flew below the stall speed of German fighters, making it nearly impossible to shoot down by conventional means. The Night Witches would attack every 15-20 minutes throughout the night, dropping small bombs that did limited physical damage but devastated German morale. Soldiers couldn't sleep, couldn't rest, and lived in constant fear of the next silent attack. One pilot, Nadezhda Popova, flew 852 missions. Another, Irina Sabrova, completed 1,008 sorties. These women faced not only German anti-aircraft fire, but also severe cold, navigating with only basic instruments and sometimes handheld maps. Though the Pearl Harbor attack began at dawn on December the 7th, 1941, the night that followed was filled with terror. As darkness fell over Hawaii, paranoia gripped both military personnel and civilians. Anti-aircraft batteries fired at shadows. Nervous sentries shot at anything that moved. The fear of a second wave or even a Japanese invasion was palpable. Throughout that long night, rescue operations continued on burning ships. Men trapped in capsized vessels like the USS Oklahoma hammered on the hulls, begging for rescue. Dive teams worked by flashlight, cutting through steel to reach survivors. The waters of Pearl Harbor were thick with oil, making every spark a potential catastrophe. Survivors reported that the darkness somehow made the horror worse. The smell of fuel oil mixed with the stench of death. The sounds of explosions and men crying for help echoed across the water. Fires illuminated the scene in hellish orange light. For many, that night was worse than the attack itself, a long, agonizing wait to see if the enemy would return. On the night of May 16, 1943, 19 specially modified Lancaster bombers took off from RAF Scampton on one of the war's most audacious missions. Operation Chastise, later known as the Dambusters Raid, targeted 3 dams in Germany's industrial Ruhr Valley. Success would flood factories, disrupt steel production, and deal a devastating blow to the Nazi war machine. The challenge was enormous. The crews had to fly at exactly 60 feet above water, at precisely 220 miles per hour, and release their bouncing bombs at exactly 425 yards from the dam. All of this had to be done at night, under heavy anti-aircraft fire, using nothing more sophisticated than a simple wooden sight. Wing Commander Guy Gibson led his crew to the Mona Dam first. At 12:28 a.m. they made their approach, skimming the water while tracer fires streaked past them. Gibson's bomb bounced 3 times before striking the dam perfectly. 4 more bombers followed, their crews watching their comrades die as German anti-aircraft guns found their mark. At 12:49 a.m., the Mona Dam exploded. A wall of water 30 feet high surged down the valley at 20 miles per hour. The Eder Dam fell next. By dawn, 1,600 people were dead, including over 1,000 slave laborers. 8 of the 19 bombers were shot down. 53 brave airmen never came home. On the night of July 27, 1943, the RAF launched the second major raid of Operation Gomorrah against Hamburg. The result was something no one had predicted, a firestorm of unprecedented proportions. The combination of high explosives and incendiaries, along with weather conditions and the concentration of wooden buildings, created a self-sustaining inferno. Temperatures in the city centre reached 1,500 degrees Fahrenheit. The fire consumed oxygen so rapidly that it created hurricane-force winds of up to 150 miles per hour, sucking people into the flames. Asphalt streets melted. People attempting to hide in bomb shelters died of carbon monoxide poisoning or were baked alive as the shelters turned into ovens. The firestorm burned for 3 hours. In that time, approximately 42,600 civilians died, more than the total British deaths during the entire Blitz. Survivors described scenes from hell. People turned into living torches, families trapped behind walls of fire, the deafening roar of the firestorm drowning out even the explosions of bombs. One survivor, a woman named Elsa Wendell, recalled, "The night of the firestorm, people were on fire. They ran through the streets screaming, their hair and clothes aflame. The heat was so intense you couldn't breathe. The fire seemed alive, hunting us." On the night of November 11, 1940, the British Royal Navy executed a daring carrier-based air attack that would inspire Japanese planning for Pearl Harbor. 21 obsolete Fairey Swordfish biplanes, launched from HMS Illustrious, targeted the Italian fleet anchored at Taranto Harbor. These fabric-covered relics, looked like they belonged in World War I, not World War II. They cruised at only 85 mph, slower than many modern cars, but on this night they would change naval warfare forever. The Swordfish attacked in 2 waves, flying through intense anti-aircraft fire. Using primitive techniques, some pilots dropped flares to illuminate targets, while others made torpedo runs. They struck with devastating precision. Of the Italian fleet's 6 battleships, 3 were crippled and put out of action for months. The British lost only 2 aircraft. For the cost of 2 obsolete biplanes, the Royal Navy had shifted the balance of power in the Mediterranean. The raid proved that battleships were vulnerable to air attack even in harbour, a lesson the Japanese studied carefully before attacking Pearl Harbor 13 months later. After the disastrous daylight raid on Schweinfurt on August 17, 1943, American crews learned a brutal lesson about German air defences. The mission cost 60 bombers and 600 men. When darkness fell that night, the survivors who had managed to limp back to England faced another nightmare, landing their shot-up planes in the dark. Many B-17s returned with wounded or dead crew members, with engines failing, with hydraulic systems destroyed. Some had holes large enough to walk through. As these damaged bombers attempted to land at English airfields, crews discovered that the night could be as deadly as enemy fire. Ground crews watched in horror as damaged bombers overshot runways, crashed on approach, or collapsed on landing gear that had been shot away. Some planes, low on fuel after nursing crippled engines across the channel, flamed out on their landing approach and crashed in the darkness beyond the runway lights. The psychological impact on surviving crews was profound. They had survived the hell of German fighters and flak only to face the terror of landing a crippled aircraft in the dark. Many airmen reported that the nights after missions were worse than the missions themselves, as they relived the experience in nightmares. On the night of March 9, 1945, American B-29 superfortresses executed the single deadliest air raid in history. Over 300 bombers attacked Tokyo from low altitude, dropping 1,665 tons of incendiary bombs on the most densely populated area on Earth. The raid was meticulously planned by General Curtis LeMay to create maximum destruction. Unlike previous high-altitude precision raids, the B-29S would attack at just 5,000 to 7,000 feet, flying in loose formation to overwhelm Japanese defenses. Their target, the densely packed wooden residential districts of eastern Tokyo. The attack began shortly after midnight. Pathfinder aircraft marked a giant X of fire across the target area. What followed was apocalyptic. The incendiaries created firestorms that generated winds up to 125 mph. Canals boiled, glass melted. People caught in the firestorm were incinerated instantly. Approximately 100,000 people died that night, more than either atomic bomb would kill. Over 1 million people were left homeless. The attack burned 16 square miles of Tokyo to ashes. Survivors described people jumping into canals to escape the heat, only to be boiled alive. Others suffocated as the firestorm consumed all oxygen. American bomber crews flying at low altitude reported that the smell of burning flesh permeated their aircraft. Some airmen vomited from the stench, others wept. The thermal updrafts from the firestorm were so powerful that they tossed the massive B-29S around like toys. One pilot said, "The fires were so intense we could read our maps by their light from 5,000 feet." On the night of January 30, 1945, the deadliest maritime disaster in history occurred in the icy Baltic Sea. The German ship Wilhelm Gustloff packed with over 10,000 refugees fleeing the advancing Soviet army, was torpedoed by Soviet submarine S-13. The ship had been designed to carry 1,900 passengers. That night, it carried more than 10,000, mostly women, children, and elderly Germans evacuating East Prussia. They huddled in every available space, desperate to escape the Red Army's advance. The temperature was below zero, and ice floes dotted the dark waters. At 9:10 p.m., Soviet commander Alexander Marinesko fired 3 torpedoes. All 3 struck the Gustloff. The ship, with no military escort and its safety equipment compromised by overcrowding, was doomed. Panic erupted immediately. The electricity failed, plunging the ship into darkness. Icy water rushed through the corridors as the ship listed severely to port. Parents threw their children into lifeboats. People jumped into water so cold it would kill them in minutes. The lifeboats that were launched successfully often capsized in the rough seas. Some people were crushed by falling lifeboats. Others froze to death while still on deck, unable to fight through the panicked crowds to reach an exit. The Gustloff sank in just 45 minutes. Of the more than 10,000 people aboard, only about 1,000 survived. It was a death toll 6 times higher than the Titanic, yet few people today have heard of it. For German refugees, the night of January 30th, 1945, represented the ultimate terror. Trapped on a sinking ship in darkness, in freezing water, with no hope of rescue. On the night of March 30th, 31, 1944, the RAF launched what would become one of its most disastrous raids of the war. 795 bombers set course for Nuremberg, but German night fighters were waiting. The full moon and clear skies, terrible conditions for a night raid, allowed Luftwaffe pilots to spot the bomber stream easily. For the British crews, it was a nightmare that lasted for hours. German night fighters equipped with advanced radar and guided by ground controllers tore through the bomber formations. The burning aircraft falling from the sky created a highway of fire across Germany. 95 bombers were shot down, almost 12% of the force. Over 670 men died that night, and hundreds more were captured. The bombers that did reach Nuremberg found the city obscured by clouds and scattered their bombs ineffectively. The raid accomplished almost nothing while costing the RAF one of its heaviest losses of the war. For the surviving crews, the flight home was a test of nerves. Every shadow could be a night fighter. Every tracer round could be aimed at them. Men watched their friends' aircraft explode into fireballs and wondered if they would be next. Though the Dieppe raid of August 19, 1942 was a daylight disaster, the night that followed was equally terrifying for the survivors. Over 900 Canadian soldiers were trapped on the beaches or in the town, wounded, surrounded, and running out of ammunition. As darkness fell, they faced the choice of surrendering or attempting to escape across the Channel. Small groups of men tried to swim out to sea, hoping to be picked up by British vessels. Many drowned in the attempt. Others hid in the ruins of Dieppe, waiting for nightfall to make their escape. German search parties combed through the rubble with flashlights and dogs. Those who were wounded faced the worst fate. Lying on the beach or in burning buildings, they could hear German soldiers approaching, knew capture was inevitable, and worried whether they would survive the night. The sound of gunfire continued sporadically through the darkness as German troops cleared buildings and mopped up resistance. Of the 6,086 men who landed at Dieppe, 3,623 became casualties, killed, wounded, or captured. For the survivors, the memory of that night haunted them forever. On the night of February 13, 14, 1945, Dresden became the target of one of the war's most controversial bombing raids. The city, packed with refugees fleeing the Eastern Front, was attacked by RAF bombers in 2 waves, specifically designed to create a firestorm. The first wave of 244 Lancaster bombers arrived at 10:15 p.m., dropping high explosives to blow off roofs and smash water mains, followed by incendiaries to set fires in the exposed buildings. 3 hours later, just as rescue workers and civilians emerged from shelters, the second wave struck. 529 more Lancasters, dropping another massive load of incendiaries on a city already burning. The combination created a firestorm that consumed 8 square miles of the city centre. Temperatures exceeded 1,800 degrees Fahrenheit. The fire created a tornado of flame that sucked people off their feet and threw them into the inferno. Stone buildings collapsed from the heat. The Elbe River was filled with people trying to escape the flames. The exact death toll remains disputed, but estimates range from 25,000 to 40,000 people killed. For survivors, the night was indescribable. One woman recalled, "People were stuck to the asphalt like flies to flypaper. The heat had melted the road surface and they sank into it. Those who fell couldn't get up." The famous Frauenkirche, Dresden's Baroque masterpiece, withstood the bombing through the night, but collapsed the next morning from heat damage. The city's destruction became a symbol of the horror of modern warfare, a debate that continues today about whether such devastation was militarily necessary or a war crime. While most kamikaze attacks occurred during daylight, some of the most terrifying happened at night. American sailors on picket duty near Okinawa faced the nightmare of radar-evading Japanese suicide pilots approaching under cover of darkness. The first indication of an attack was often the sound of an aircraft engine growing louder. Searchlights would frantically scan the sky. Anti-aircraft guns would open fire at shadows. Sometimes the plane would crash into the ship before anyone even saw it coming. Night kamikaze attacks created intense paranoia. Sailors slept in their clothes, life jackets nearby. The call to battle stations in the middle of the night, followed by the uncertainty of whether a kamikaze was inbound, frayed nerves to the breaking point. The night attacks of World War II represent some of humanity's darkest moments, both literally and figuratively. From the Blitz to the firebombing of Dresden, from Taranto to Tokyo, these operations pushed the boundaries of warfare into civilian populations and moral grey areas. For those who experienced them, these nights never truly ended. Survivors carried the trauma for the rest of their lives. The sounds, smells, and sights haunted their dreams. Children who lived through the Blitz reported nightmares decades later. Veterans who flew bombing missions struggled with guilt and PTSD. These stories remind us of the true cost of war, not just the strategic objectives achieved or lost, but the human suffering endured in darkness when fear multiplies and hope fades. They serve as testament to both humanity's capacity for destruction and its incredible will to survive. The terror of these nights changed warfare forever, proving that darkness could be weaponized, that civilian morale was a legitimate target, and that technology could extend warfare into every hour of the day. We must remember these nights not to glorify war, but to understand its true horror and work to prevent such darkness from falling again.